Story number 1.
The night was impossibly dark, the kind of darkness that wraps around you and swallows every detail, leaving only the faint hum of your own thoughts and the occasional sound of tires against wet asphalt. Sarah had been driving for what felt like hours, the road stretching endlessly in front of her. Her headlights barely pierced the thick fog that clung to the road, and the low, steady thrum of the engine was the only thing that kept her tethered to reality. She was heading home after a work trip, and the hour was late, around 2 a.m. She wasn't unfamiliar with long drives, but tonight felt different. The quiet of the countryside and the absence of other cars made the journey seem more isolated than usual. Every corner she rounded felt like it could lead into another world entirely. The GPS on her phone had started acting up an hour ago, losing signal and then redirecting her along narrow, unfamiliar roads. She had passed through a few small towns, but now found herself completely alone on a stretch of highway that seemed to have no end. She wasn't sure where she was anymore. The soft chime of the low battery indicator startled her, and she quickly plugged the phone into the charger, hoping it would last long enough to help her navigate her way out of this place. She glanced at the clock. 2:30 a.m. Her stomach growled, reminding her she hadn't eaten since dinner. She knew there was a gas station a few miles up ahead. At least, she hoped there was. The thought of stopping for a break made her stomach twist in knots. Something about the empty, shadowy road ahead made her feel uneasy. As if on cue, the gas station appeared in the distance, its flickering lights barely visible through the mist. Relief washed over her. She pulled off the highway and into the parking lot, grateful for the small patch of civilization. The rain, which had been steady but light, was now beginning to come down harder, the droplets tapping against the roof of her car. She parked under a dim streetlight and got out, taking a deep breath of the cool, damp air. The station was empty, save for a single attendant behind the counter. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his face illuminated by the glow of a small television in the corner. Sarah stepped into the store, her boots squeaking on the wet floor. "Hey, can I get some gas and a snack?" she asked, her voice a bit more shaky than she intended. The attendant looked up slowly, blinking as if startled. His eyes were unfocused, and his face looked strange, almost vacant, as if he hadn't slept in days. Sure," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "Just go around back to the pump." He gestured lazily toward the window, his hand lingering in the air as though unsure of where to place it. Sarah hesitated but nodded and stepped back outside, walking to her car. The rain was heavier now, and she hurried to the pump, cursing under her breath as she fumbled with the nozzle. She was just about to pull it out when she heard something, a soft, muffled sound, like a car approaching, but it wasn't coming from the road. She froze. It was coming from behind the gas station. Her heart rate spiked as she quickly glanced over her shoulder, but the parking lot was still empty. The sound was getting louder. Footsteps, maybe? Slow and deliberate. She turned back to her car, suddenly feeling very exposed out here in the open. There was no one in the parking lot, and the only sign of movement was the occasional sway of the trees in the storm. The footsteps stopped. Then, as if the air around her had thickened, she heard a voice. Soft at first, a whispering murmur that sent a chill crawling up her spine. "Help me," it said. The words were barely a whisper, but they echoed in her ears as if someone were speaking directly into them. She turned in a slow circle, looking around the empty lot. There was no one in sight. "Help me," the voice repeated, clearer this time, as if it was right behind her. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as she spun around, her pulse roaring in her ears. But again, the lot was empty. She felt as though the air was closing in around her, suffocating her. The voice seemed to linger, hanging in the space between the rain's pounding rhythm. Suddenly, she felt a hand on her shoulder. Sarah screamed and whipped around, but no one was there. Her breathing was rapid, her chest tight with panic. Her eyes darted back to the station, where the attendant still stood, staring at her. "Are you all right?" he asked in a monotone voice. She nodded quickly, though her hands were shaking so violently that she could barely grip the gas pump. "Just finishing up," she said, her voice shaky. The man didn't say anything else, but his unblinking stare sent a shiver through her. Sarah paid for the gas and made a beeline back to her car. her breath coming in short bursts as she tried to calm herself. She started the engine and pulled out of the lot as quickly as she could, the tires screeching as she turned back onto the highway. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the strange encounter. Was it exhaustion? She hadn't been sleeping well lately. Could she have imagined it? But no, she could still feel the pressure of that hand on her shoulder. The road ahead was empty, the fog swirling around her headlights. It felt like she was driving through a tunnel, the trees on either side of the road appearing to close in with each passing minute. The silence of the night was suffocating, and the occasional wiper swipe only made the world outside seem more distant. She glanced in the rearview mirror, almost expecting to see headlights following her, but nothing. Only the dull glow of the streetlights in the distance. She relaxed slightly, telling herself it was over, that she was just tired and imagining things. And then she saw it. A figure in the middle of the road, standing still under the thick blanket of fog. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The figure was tall and unnaturally thin, its body angular and twisting, as though it were bent in a way that didn't make sense. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, and its arms hung at its sides like they were far too long for its body. The car began to slow, almost as if by its own accord. Sarah's foot wasn't on the brake, but the car was coming to a stop. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its presence, its coldness pressing against her, just beyond the window. Her breath hitched, her hands frozen on the wheel. She wanted to scream, but the air felt heavy in her lungs. She couldn't tear her eyes away. The figure's head snapped up, and its black, hollow eyes locked onto hers. Then the voice returned. "Help me." This time it wasn't a whisper. It was a roar, deafening and full of anguish. The sound reverberated through her chest, shaking her to her core. Before she could react, the figure vanished. The fog around her cleared, the road before her stretching back into the normal darkness. Sarah's hands were slick with sweat, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her foot slammed down on the accelerator, the car lurching forward as she raced down the road. She drove for what felt like hours, not daring to stop again until she reached a town, where she finally pulled into a well-lit gas station. When Sarah stepped out, the attendant was nowhere to be seen. A chill crept up her spine as she looked around. Everything felt wrong. The darkness, the silence, the absence of people. It was only then that she noticed the figure standing across the street watching her. It was tall, thin, bent unnaturally.
Story number 2.
The rain had started as a light drizzle, but had quickly turned into a relentless downpour. James tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he guided his old sedan along the winding country road. He hadn't planned to take this route, but a highway closure had forced him onto the back roads. Now he found himself alone, far from any town, with only the rhythmic slap of the wipers and the hum of the engine for company. The dashboard clock read 12:37 a.m., the glowing numbers casting an eerie green light on his face. He hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and the isolation was beginning to wear on him. The dense forest on either side of the road seemed to press in closer, the trees swaying and creaking in the wind. James shook his head, trying to ward off the drowsiness creeping in. "Just a little longer," he muttered to himself. He adjusted the radio, but only static greeted him. Frustrated, he turned it off and focused on the road. As he rounded a bend, his headlights illuminated a figure standing at the edge of the road. His heart leaped into his throat, and he instinctively hit the brakes. The car slowed to a crawl as he strained to see through the rain-slicked windshield. It was a woman, dressed in what looked like a white gown, her long hair plastered to her face by the rain. She stood completely still, her arms hanging limply at her sides. James hesitated. Picking up hitchhikers was something he'd sworn never to do, but leaving someone out in this weather felt wrong. He rolled down the passenger side window slightly, letting in a rush of cold, damp air. "Do you need help?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. She just stood there, her head tilted slightly downward as if staring at her feet. A chill ran down James's spine. Something about her stillness was deeply unsettling. "Miss?" he tried again, but the words felt hollow. The woman slowly lifted her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, James couldn't quite see her eyes. They seemed to be shadowed, even in the glow of his headlights. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, but he couldn't bring himself to drive away. He opened his mouth to speak again, when she suddenly turned and walked into the forest, disappearing into the darkness without a sound. James sat frozen, his heart pounding in his chest. The rain hammered against the car, the sound filling the silence left in her wake. After a moment, he shook his head and muttered, "Probably just trying to find shelter." He rolled up the window and drove on, but the image of her pale face lingered in his mind. Something about her had been off, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The road stretched on, twisting and turning through the dense woods. The rain showed no signs of letting up, and James found himself glancing in the rearview mirror more often than usual. He told himself it was just paranoia, but the feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Then it happened. The radio, which he'd turned off, crackled to life. Static filled the car, loud and jarring, making him jump. He fumbled with the dial, trying to turn it off, but it wouldn't budge. The static grew louder, almost deafening, and then he heard it. A voice. "Don't stop." James's blood ran cold. The voice was faint, distorted but unmistakable. His hands trembled as he hit the power button repeatedly, but the radio wouldn't turn off. The voice repeated, clearer this time. "Don't stop." The radio went silent as suddenly as it had started. James's heart pounded in his chest as he gripped the wheel tighter. "This is insane," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. He pressed on, his eyes darting between the road and the mirrors. The forest seemed darker now, the shadows deeper. Every rustle of leaves and creak of branches sounded louder, closer. And then, in the middle of the road, he saw her again. The woman was standing directly in his path, her white gown billowing slightly in the wind. James slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. The car skidded to a stop just a few feet from her. She didn't move. James's breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at her through the windshield. Her hair was matted to her face, obscuring her features, but he could feel her gaze on him. His hands trembled on the wheel as he whispered, "What do you want?" The woman tilted her head slightly, her movements slow and unnatural. Then, with deliberate steps, she began to walk toward the car. Panic surged through James. He threw the car into reverse, but it wouldn't move. The engine sputtered and stalled, leaving him stranded. The woman continued her approach, her figure growing larger in the rain-dappled windshield. "Stay away," he shouted, his voice cracking. He fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The locks clicked and clacked as if under their own control, trapping him inside. The woman reached the front of the car and stopped. Slowly, she lifted her head, and James finally saw her eyes. They were black, empty voids that seemed to pull him in, suffocating him with a cold dread. She placed a hand on the hood of the car. The engine roared back to life on its own, and the headlights flickered wildly. James slammed his foot on the gas, the tires spinning before finding traction. The car lurched forward, but when he looked back, the woman was gone. He didn't stop. He didn't look back. He drove as fast as he dared, the rain blurring his vision and the darkness pressing in on him. The feeling of being watched never left him, and every so often he caught glimpses of her in the rearview mirror. Always just for a split second, always standing perfectly still. Finally, after what felt like hours, he saw the faint glow of a town in the distance. Relief flooded through him as he pulled into a gas station on the outskirts. He parked haphazardly and stumbled out of the car, his legs shaky beneath him. The attendant, a grizzled old man with a cigarette dangling from his lips, looked up from his magazine. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said with a chuckle. James didn't respond. He grabbed a bottle of water from the cooler and downed it in one go, trying to steady his nerves. "You all right, son?" the attendant asked, his tone more serious now. James hesitated, then shook his head. "Just a weird night." The attendant nodded knowingly. "You're not the first. Folks driving that road at night see all kinds of things. Best advice? Don't stop." James froze, the man's words echoing the voice from the radio. He turned to look back at his car, half expecting to see her standing there, but the lot was empty. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The rain hammered against the windshield, the rhythmic drumming swallowed by the roar of the engine and the faint static of the radio. Lily squinted through the downpour, gripping the steering wheel tightly as the empty road stretched endlessly before her. The clock on the dashboard blinked 11:58 p.m., the dim green numbers glowing faintly in the darkened cabin. She had been driving for hours, her phone dead since sunset, leaving her with only a tattered map and vague directions scrawled on a sticky note. The GPS had failed hours ago, somewhere along the narrow, winding roads that led her deeper into the forested hills. She cursed herself for agreeing to this midnight drive to her cousin's remote cabin. It had seemed like a good idea in daylight. Now it felt like a terrible mistake. The rain showed no sign of letting up. The narrow two-lane road snaked between towering pine trees that swayed in the wind, their shadows dancing eerily in her headlights. Each mile felt longer than the last, the oppressive darkness closing in like a living thing. Suddenly the engine sputtered. The car jerked and the headlights flickered. No, 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 Lily muttered, her voice trembling. The engine groaned again, then died entirely, leaving her in suffocating silence. The headlights dimmed until only the weak glow of the dashboard remained. She coasted to the side of the road and turned the key, but the engine refused to start. With a frustrated sigh, she slammed her palm against the steering wheel. "Great," she muttered. She peered out into the darkness, hoping to spot a house or a gas station, but there was nothing, just the unbroken line of trees and the whispering rain. Lily grabbed her flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the storm. The rain was icy, soaking her clothes in seconds. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, the kind of scent that would have been calming in any other situation. As she aimed the beam of her flashlight up and down the road, a faint glimmer caught her eye, a reflective road sign a few yards ahead. It read, "Cold Hollow, 2 miles." Maybe there's something there, she muttered to herself, pulling her jacket tighter. With her phone useless and no cars in sight, walking seemed her only option. She grabbed her keys, locked the car, and began trudging up the road. The night was eerily quiet, the rain muffling all sound except for her footsteps. Every now and then the wind would rush through the trees, causing branches to groan and creak. Lily kept her eyes on the road, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Shadows shifted at the edges of her vision, and she found herself glancing over her shoulder every few steps. After what felt like an eternity, she saw a faint light in the distance. Relief flooded her as she quickened her pace. The light grew brighter, revealing an old gas station with a single flickering bulb above the entrance. The building looked abandoned, its windows fogged and smeared with dirt. Still, it was shelter. Lily pushed open the door, the bell above jingling faintly. The interior smelled of mildew and motor oil, the shelves half empty and coated in dust. A man stood behind the counter, his head bowed as he scribbled something on a notepad. He was pale, with gaunt features and sunken eyes that flicked up to meet hers as she entered. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. "Yes," Lily said, forcing a smile. "It just died on the road a couple of miles back." The man nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on her longer than she liked. "Happens a lot out here," he said. "These roads aren't friendly after dark." Lily shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the dimly lit store. "Do you have a phone I could use? Mine's dead." The man hesitated, then shook his head. "Phone lines are down. Storm, probably." "Of course," Lily muttered, exasperated. "Do you know of any mechanics nearby?" "There's one in town," the man said, "but it's late. He won't be open until morning. You can wait here if you like." He gestured to a corner of the store where a battered couch sat beneath a flickering fluorescent light. Lily hesitated. Something about the man's demeanor unsettled her. "Thanks, but I think I'll keep walking," she said. "I'm headed to my cousin's cabin near Cold Hollow." The man's expression darkened. "Cold Hollow?" he repeated, his voice dropping even lower. "You shouldn't go there. Not tonight." "Why not?" Lily asked, her heart skipping a beat. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "This place, it's different after midnight. Things come out, things you don't want to meet." Lily swallowed hard. "Are you trying to scare me?" "No," he said. "I'm trying to warn you." Before she could respond, the door behind her creaked open. A gust of wind swept in, carrying with it a bone-chilling cold. Lily turned to see nothing. The road was empty, the rain falling steadily, yet the door remained open, as though something unseen had pushed it ajar. The man behind the counter paled. "You need to leave," he said urgently. "Now." Lily didn't need to be told twice. She bolted out of the store, the door slamming shut behind her. The rain had lessened, but the air felt heavier, as if charged with electricity. She began walking faster, her flashlight beam trembling as her hand shook. The road ahead seemed endless, the trees closing in like a tunnel. Shadows danced just out of reach, and the faint sound of footsteps echoed her own. She spun around, the flashlight cutting through the darkness, but no one was there. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely audible over the rain. No response. She picked up her pace, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She broke into a run, the beam of her flashlight bouncing wildly. Ahead, she saw the faint outline of a sign. "Welcome to Cold Hollow." The sign was old and weathered, its paint peeling. Beyond it, the road widened into a clearing, and there in the center stood an old house. Its windows were dark, its silhouette imposing against the stormy sky. Lily hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to turn back. But the footsteps behind her were growing louder, and she had nowhere else to go. She sprinted toward the house, throwing herself against the heavy wooden door. To her surprise, it creaked open, revealing a dimly lit interior. She stepped inside, slamming the door shut behind her. The room was musty and filled with antique furniture, as though frozen in time. A fire crackled weakly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Lily's flashlight flickered, then died, plunging her into near darkness. The fire's light was weak, but enough to reveal a figure standing at the far end of the room. A woman, pale and dressed in tattered clothing, stared at her with hollow eyes. "You shouldn't have come," the woman said, her voice echoing unnaturally. Lily backed away, her breath catching in her throat. "I didn't mean to. My car broke down." "They always break down," the woman interrupted, her gaze unblinking. "They want you here." "Who?" Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she raised a trembling hand and pointed to the window. Lily turned slowly, her blood running cold. Outside, figures stood in the rain, their forms barely visible but unmistakably human. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes glowed faintly in the darkness. "They're here," the woman said, her voice cracking. "They always come." Lily's scream caught in her throat as the fire suddenly went out, plunging the room into blackness. The last thing she heard before everything went silent was the sound of the door creaking open. Story the end.
Story number 4.
The highway stretched out like a ribbon of darkness, its edges swallowed by dense trees that loomed in the moonlight. Adam's car was the only source of movement, its headlights slicing through the night as he drove. He wasn't supposed to be on this stretch of road so late, but a last-minute meeting had delayed his return home. Now it was just him, the sound of his car's engine, and the whisper of wind against the windows. The clock on the dashboard blinked 1:47 a.m. His GPS had directed him to a shortcut that he vaguely remembered from years ago, but the road felt different now, more isolated, more empty. He yawned, stretching one hand briefly before returning it to the wheel. Ahead, the road curved sharply to the left, and as Adam rounded the bend, he saw it. A figure standing on the shoulder of the road. His breath hitched as he instinctively let his foot off the gas. The person, no, it was a woman, stood unnervingly still, her long, black, dark hair hanging over her face. She wore a white dress that looked out of place in the cold night air, the fabric swaying gently in the breeze. Adam slowed down, his grip tightening on the wheel. He debated whether to stop, but something about the way she stood there sent a shiver down his spine. He pressed on, deciding it was safer to keep moving. As his car passed her, he glanced in the rearview mirror. She was gone. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. His pulse quickened, but he told himself it was nothing. Maybe she had moved, or he had imagined her altogether. It was late, and he was tired. Miles passed in silence, the trees on either side of the road blending into a blur. He tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that lingered from the encounter. Then the faint sound of static broke the stillness. Adam glanced at the radio. It was off. The static grew louder, crackling through the car's speakers as if someone had flipped a switch. He reached for the volume knob, but as his fingers touched it, a voice emerged from the static. "Stop the car." Adam jerked his hand back, his heart racing. The voice was soft but insistent, like a whisper spoken directly into his ear. He slammed the radio off, but the static continued, growing louder, more distorted. "Stop the car." "No," Adam muttered, his voice trembling. He pressed harder on the gas, his car accelerating as he tried to outrun whatever was happening. The road ahead seemed endless, a black void stretching out forever. The trees on either side looked as though they were closing in, their shadows twisting and writhing like living things. Adam kept his eyes fixed on the asphalt, refusing to look anywhere else. And then she was in the road, the woman from before standing directly in his path. Adam screamed, slamming on the brakes. The car skidded, tires screeching as it fishtailed. He barely managed to avoid hitting her, the vehicle coming to a stop inches from where she stood. She didn't move. Adam sat frozen, his chest heaving as he stared at her through the windshield. Her face was clearer now, illuminated by the harsh glow of the headlights. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were black voids, empty and unblinking. She lifted one hand and pointed at him. Adam's breath caught in his throat. He tried to reverse, but the car wouldn't move. The engine groaned, the tires spinning uselessly. "Go away," he shouted, his voice cracking. The woman tilted her head, her gaze unwavering. Slowly, she began to walk toward the car, her bare feet making no sound on the pavement. Panic surged through Adam as he fumbled with the gear shift, desperately trying to make the car move. The engine roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas. The car surged forward, and the woman vanished. He didn't stop to question it. He just drove, the adrenaline pumping through his veins, pushing him to go faster and faster. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees blurring into indistinct shapes. Finally, he spotted lights in the distance. A gas station. Relief washed over him as he pulled into the lot, his hands trembling on the wheel. He parked and stumbled out of the car, his legs weak beneath him. The gas station attendant, a middle-aged man with a weary expression, looked up as Adam entered. "You okay?" the man asked, his voice tinged with concern. Adam nodded, though his heart was still racing. "Yeah, just long drive." The attendant gave him a once-over before shrugging and returning to his newspaper. Adam grabbed a bottle of water and sat at one of the small tables inside, trying to collect himself. As he sipped the water, he glanced out the window. The lot was empty, his car sitting where he'd left it. For the first time in hours, he felt a sliver of calm, and then he saw her reflection in the glass. She was standing right behind him. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The engine's low hum was the only companion Rachel had as she navigated the deserted highway. The clock on her dashboard read 11:23 p.m., and the green glow of its numbers seemed brighter than the scattered streetlights piercing the darkness outside. The route stretched endlessly ahead, with no sign of towns or rest stops. She hated driving alone at night, but her sister's wedding the next day left her no choice. Rachel had promised to help with last-minute preparations, and a late departure from work had turned her planned daylight drive into a solitary journey through a seemingly abandoned stretch of road. Rain started as a light drizzle, then intensified quickly. She flicked on the wipers, their rhythmic squeaks failing to provide much comfort against the storm. Her headlights illuminated only a short span of the road ahead, leaving the rest shrouded in impenetrable blackness. The highway was empty, eerily so. Rachel hadn't seen another car for miles. She tried the radio, hoping for music to break the silence, but static hissed back at her. Frustrated, she switched it off, the absence of sound amplifying the patter of rain against the windshield. It was then that she noticed it. The figure. It was just standing there on the shoulder of the road. At first she thought it might be a trick of the rain or her tired eyes, but as she got closer, she saw it was unmistakably a person. A man, tall and gaunt, dressed in dark clothing that clung to his frame in the downpour. He didn't wave or signal for help. He simply stood still, staring at her car as she approached. Rachel's hands tightened on the wheel, her pulse quickening. She instinctively locked the doors, even though there was no reason for him to approach. Something about his posture, unnaturally rigid, almost statuesque, set her on edge. As she passed him, her headlights briefly illuminated his face, and her stomach dropped. His eyes were wrong. They were wide, too wide, and completely black, as though the rain had swallowed any light within them. His expression didn't change as her car sped past, but she felt his gaze linger, heavy and unrelenting. Her breathing was shallow, her hands trembling slightly as she glanced at the rearview mirror. The road behind her was empty. The man was gone. That didn't happen. She whispered to herself, her voice shaky. I'm just tired. It was the rain. She tried to focus on the drive, convincing herself it had been her imagination. But her heart wouldn't slow, and the oppressive silence inside the car seemed louder now. She turned the radio back on, the static filling the cabin like a lifeline. Then the static changed. It wasn't random noise anymore. It was rhythmic. A low, pulsing sound emerged, faint at first but growing louder, like a heartbeat. Rachel's fingers hovered over the dial, but before she could turn it off, a voice crackled through the speakers. Stop the car. Her foot slammed on the brakes before she realized what she was doing. The car screeched to a halt, skidding slightly on the wet road. For a moment she sat frozen, gripping the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The voice didn't come again. The static resumed, monotonous and unthreatening. Just keep going, she muttered, her voice breaking. Don't stop. Keep driving. She pressed on the gas, the car lurching forward. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror again, and this time she saw something. In the distance, faint but unmistakable, were headlights. Relief washed over her. Another car. She wasn't alone out here. The lights grew brighter as the vehicle approached. It was moving fast, much faster than her cautious pace. She eased over to the right lane, letting it pass, but it didn't. Instead, the headlights stayed behind her, their brightness glaring through her rear window. Great, she muttered. Some jerk tailgating me. She tried speeding up, but the car behind her matched her pace. She slowed down. It slowed too. The road was still empty, aside from them, no exits or side streets where it might turn off. The oppressive rain blurred her vision, but she could make out the vehicle's outline now. It was an old car, boxy and battered, its headlights flickering occasionally. Rachel's unease deepened. The driver hadn't honked, flashed their lights, or tried to overtake her. They just followed, an unyielding presence in her rearview mirror. Just go around, she said aloud, as if the driver could hear her. Her voice quivered with frustration and fear. She tapped the brakes lightly, hoping to signal them to pass, but the headlights remained steady. Then, in an instant, they were gone. One moment, the car was there. The next, the road behind her was empty again. Rachel's stomach churned as dread clawed at her chest. Her eyes darted back and forth between the road ahead and the mirrors, searching for any sign of the other car. But there was nothing. She pressed harder on the gas, desperate to put distance between herself and whatever was out there. The rain eased slightly, revealing the faint outline of a bridge ahead. Relief flooded her as she realized it might lead her closer to civilization. But as she neared, she saw something that made her heart plummet. The man from before stood in the middle of the bridge. Her breath caught in her throat. His posture was the same, unnervingly stiff, his face turned directly toward her. The same black eyes stared back, devoid of emotion or life. This time he raised a hand and pointed at her, an accusatory gesture that sent a chill racing down her spine. Move, she shouted, slamming her hand on the horn. The sound blared, echoing through the storm, but the man didn't flinch. He stayed rooted in place, his arms still outstretched. Rachel swerved, narrowly avoiding him. The car skidded slightly as it cleared the bridge, her tires squealing against the wet pavement. When she dared to look in the rearview mirror again, the bridge was empty. No man. No car. She drove faster, her pulse racing, her mind screaming for her to get away. The rain fell harder again, the wipers struggling to keep up. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning without destination. She didn't care where she ended up. She just wanted to escape. Then the radio crackled again. Stop the car, the voice said, louder this time, more insistent. No, Rachel screamed, slamming her palm against the dashboard. Leave me alone. The lights on her dashboard flickered. The engine sputtered, and the car began to slow despite her foot pressing hard on the gas. Panic surged through her as the vehicle rolled to a stop on the side of the road. The rain stopped suddenly, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Rachel sat motionless, gripping the wheel, her breaths shallow and rapid. The headlights illuminated a small stretch of road, but beyond that, everything was pitch black. A knock on the driver's side window shattered the silence. She screamed, jerking away from the door. Outside, silhouetted against the faint glow of her headlights, was the man. His black eyes bore into hers, his expression still unreadable. He knocked again, harder this time, the sound echoing in the still night. Rachel's mind raced. She couldn't stay here, but the car wouldn't start. Her shaking hands fumbled with the keys, twisting them desperately in the ignition. The engine whined but refused to turn over. The man moved closer, his face now inches from the glass. His lips parted slightly, as if he were about to speak. Rachel slammed her hand on the horn again, the noise cutting through the oppressive quiet, but it didn't faze him. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. The engine roared to life. Without hesitation, Rachel floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as the car shot forward. She didn't look back, didn't stop, didn't think. The road blurred as tears streamed down her face, mixing with the rainwater still dripping from her hair. It wasn't until she saw the glowing lights of a gas station in the distance that she allowed herself to hope. She pulled into the lot, her hands trembling as she parked. The attendant inside looked up, startled, as she stumbled through the door. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice concerned. Rachel opened her mouth to answer, but the words wouldn't come. She glanced back toward her car, half expecting to see the man standing there. The lot was empty. "Miss?" the attendant pressed gently. "I." She paused, her voice barely a whisper. "I just need a break." The man nodded, handing her a bottle of water. She sat down on a bench near the door, the harsh fluorescent lights of the station, a comforting contrast to the suffocating darkness of the road. For the rest of her journey, Rachel didn't look in the rearview mirror. She didn't dare. Story the end.